Hello! Today I'm taking a look at The Last of Us, a prestigious 2013 release by Naughty Dog that has persisted as one of the marquee titles of the PlayStation 3. And while some have been fatigued by its number of remasters and releases to date, it has certainly endured as a popular game that has spawned sequels, ports, and a live-action adaptation, which is each testament to its ongoing appeal. Now, I personally loved The Last of Us, but I do have a confession to make right off the bat, which is that when it was first released, I didn't take much of an interest in it. And I think the reason being is that if we cast our minds back to that particular time and place, there was a definite saturation of post-apocalyptic and zombie-related media all over the place. The Walking Dead was just coming off its narrative peak. Movies like World War Z, Zombieland, The Book of Eli, and I Am Legend had each been released in the few years prior to The Last of Us. And I think I'd also just finished Cormac McCarthy's novel The Road around the time The Last of Us came out, which emotionally ruined me, and I couldn't really face any more bleakness that came with this particular genre. But as if to make it 10 times worse for myself, I did finally get around to playing The Last of Us and The Last of Us Part 2 after the latter's much hyped release during the 2020 pandemic lockdown, which was a really strange time in and of itself, let alone one to experience a survival action game based in the wake of a global pandemic. So that definitely gave it an air of tangibility to exacerbate my existential dread. But nonetheless, I found The Last of Us to be a fantastic experience that was not only a compelling story, but excelled in arenas of user experience design and gameplay design to really craft the structure, pace, and player participation in an involved and intriguing way. So, extremely belatedly, I came to appreciate the appeal and the renown that surrounds the Last of Us saga, which I'll proceed to break down and discuss over the course of this episode. Now, jumping right in, I'll get to the themes, the story and the characters shortly, because I think the bulk of this game and its enduring appeal does reside on the fantastic storycraft, the pace and the structure of this game's escalating narrative and the characters therein. However, I would like to touch on gameplay first, and how it interweaves with and complements the story, chunking the game up into often tense yet meaningful puzzle and combat scenarios that almost always reward the player with either diegetic in-game benefits, such as weapons and item hauls, or by giving us a bit of character development or escalation that works in service of the story. And indeed, it is quite difficult to talk independently about the game's qualities of gameplay or the game's qualities of story, because they are so intricate and interwoven. But I will briefly summarise with some of the key gameplay elements and mechanisms that kind of stood out for me and I think contribute to the overall experience and setting. And first off, as I've mentioned, the gameplay really chunks up the game well and creates a steady pace where through certain story-driven scenarios, such as being chased and crashing a car into a building or falling through some dilapidated flooring, we find ourselves in contained interactive environments that require puzzling, combat and stealth to work our way through. The setting of The Last of Us as a post-apocalyptic wasteland is emphasised by its method of inventory and item acquisition within these environments, since it is found objects that really pave the way for our progress in terms of weaponry and ability levelling. And unlike other games where we might encounter a shop or a blacksmith or an armourer, depending on the genre, who will furnish our hero with upgrades and weapons and so on, The Last of Us relies entirely on the environment and the player's willingness to scrutinise that environment to reward us and our scavenging and subsequently boost our arsenal of weapons and our items, whether that's healing items or the pills that we can use to sort of level up abilities and so on. Additionally, aside from some stock weaponry such as handguns, a rifle, a shotgun, and of course a bow, because for some reason this era of gaming had several titles that featured bows and horses to ride, the bulk of our inventory is comprised by crafting raw materials into usable items, and the player must choose how best to utilise these resources, as and when we find them, because scarcity is a huge aspect of the gameplay here that really adds to the experience and this feeling of survival, which is a key theme and trope within this particular game. And for example, a Molotov cocktail can be made from synthesizing a rag with some alcohol, but a a health kit can also be made from the same items, so it is down to the player to weigh up the cost-benefit of each scenario and how they think it's going to play out. So the agency there and the onus on us to dictate which items we should be crafting was a really interesting aspect of the game. Moving on, but in keeping with this overarching theme of survival, which comes through in the gameplay, there's also a very interesting listening mode, which is now an increasingly common mechanic that we see in games, which allows us to perceive enemy movements and voices through solid objects within the environment and help us determine our approach. And I personally love this sort of stealth gameplay. I first saw it as a mechanic in 2012's Hitman Absolution, which was called Instinct Mode back then. And I know in the Batman Arkham games as well, they likewise have Detective Mode, which is very similar in the way it plays out and perceive things through the environment. But for The Last of Us specifically, the focus on survival and the ability to augment the experience by strategizing and perceiving where and what type of enemy you may be dealing with ahead, it was a great aspect of the overall gameplay. Finally, before moving on to story and characters, the last thing I'd like to summarise is the partnership or NPC co-op gameplay that takes place. And while I think this is mainly done in service of story, and I'll touch on it in that respect shortly, I think this is the first time I played a game that had a persistent NPC companion, at least to such an advanced level of cooperation, because of course there was Sonic 2 back in 91, 92, whenever that came out, and Jak and Daxter and so on back in the day. But I thought that this was a great aspect of the game that really services the core story and that key relationship between Joel and Ellie, and allows us to experience exposition while we're in the midst of play, which is really cool. And actually, I'm playing 2018's God of War at the minute, and the persistence of Atreus as a companion alongside Kratos serves much the same purpose and the same function as it does in The Last of Us. So I really like how the advancement of game tech is permitting this sort of thing to happen, blurring the boundaries between narrative reprieves and cinematics and the in-game action to build story as time wears on. So, gameplay summary aside, let's shift into the themes and story now. And I suppose in many ways the game taps into the tropes and thematic elements of other post-apocalyptic media, a glimpse of the human condition and civilization's ability to turn in on itself, but also the ability to persevere and adapt and survive within that world. And while this is something that's explored to some extent or another in most media within this genre, I think the way it's delivered and cultivated through the opposing personalities, perspectives, and indeed generational divide between Joel and Ellie, who are the key protagonists around which this story hinges, along with the vibrant interactive setting which brilliantly renders these devastated towns and cities, and once again the uniqueness of the medium of video games as a storytelling device is this player agency and involvement in the way that things unfold, and perhaps more so than any game I've played in recent years, the ability of The Last of Us and The Last of Us Part 2 to get players emotionally invested in these characters and their journeys was unparalleled. I think it was really well written and really well delivered. Now, on that note, I would like to kick off with the opening prologue of the game, because while it's little more than 10 minutes of gameplay, it does a whole lot to contextualise and invest us in the world and story, and particularly the character of Joel. And one thing I liked, speaking generally about zombie or infected fiction, is that unlike most other stories that throw us into a world that is already deep into the dystopia of zombies existing and having done so for a while, with 28 Days Later and The Walking Dead being prime examples of a character who wakes up in hospital and the world's already gone to ruin in their absence. By comparison, The Last of Us and the movie World War Z, being another good example, show the world turn before our eyes, and a smatter of early infected create the unfolding and escalating chaos that we're involved in. So the way The Last of Us does this is great, particularly if, like me, you go into the story dry without knowledge of what's about to take place. And on that note, I will be providing spoilers from here on throughout the episode, so if you haven't played The Last of Us, fair warning. So what the game does is it starts us off in control of Sarah, who is Joel's daughter, And from the outset, it's an ominous opening that borrows plenty of tropes from the horror movie genre. As we're alone in an empty house, there's weird noises outside, we're calling out for our father. And as we walk around the house, there is hints of what's to come, with newspaper headlines discussing a pandemic outbreak, a news report on the television that cuts out to static, voicemail messages from our anxious Uncle Tommy, who's trying to get hold of us. And this is all juxtaposed with the everyday and banal aspects of being, such as birthday cards for Joel, pictures hanging on the wall, which all adds to the unease in how it juxtaposes. So, great opening there, and we very quickly kind of get to the meat of things and get into the action, as we arrive downstairs to find Joel loading a revolver and a man who we learn was formerly our friendly next-door neighbour smashing through the window as an infected, only for Joel to shoot him. So this is a great hook into the game, because it goes from 0 to 100 within a matter of minutes, and the gameplay bleeds seamlessly between cinematic dialogues and the player controls, so it makes us feel attentive and a part of the events and the action unfolding. And much of the game unfolds this way, and I think a testament to its structure is that each chunk of scenario and gameplay sequence is always doing something in service of a character or a story, building that up, progressing it as the player works through. Now, the climactic upshot of this prologue is that Joel, Sarah and Uncle Tommy escape into town, and here we see the true chaos unfold as the infected overwhelm the police and civilians. And in its dramatic conclusion, we encounter a soldier who is evidently part of a quarantine operation, and he opens fire on us, killing Joel's daughter in the process. So, great framework to open the game with, because after a short credit roll, we pick up on the story 20 years later, and rather than needing all of this context for the world being the way it is and having to be explained to us, or even, explaining the characterization for why Joel is this sort of solemn-looking, fatalistic personality, we've been given all of that up front in a very short, concise sequence. And so it makes room for the contemporary events of the game, the plight of the Fireflies, the state of humanity, and of course the significance of Ellie and Joel's journey to take the centre stage. And indeed, by showing Joel lose his daughter in the opening moments of the game, rather than through flashbacks or dialogue or something like that later on, it gives the player a certain foresight into how and why his guardianship of Ellie is going to be quite conflicted and temperamental and detached to begin with, which I think is the emotive heart of the entire story. It's these two characters coming together, surviving together. So once again, great structure and jumping off point with which to experience the main game. And I think looking at Joel's life 20 years later is also a great narrative setup for his detachment from things, since he and his partner Tess have taken on the role of smugglers in this new authoritarian world. And so, between the strict authorities that govern the quarantine zone and the rebellious militia known as the Fireflies, who are vying for control, vying to change how people are governed, Joel operates within these circles, but remains ideologically and emotionally removed from this. And indeed, not unlike Han Solo in Star Wars, who is recruited by the rebels, but has little regard for either their cause or the Empire, it's a great window for players to look into events without overt bias or allegiance towards one side or the other. And I may expand on this, because an enduring topic among fans is whether the Fireflies or the military are good or bad, or whether everything about these factions is shades of grey. Now, the first bit of narrative when jumping into the game is, for all intents and purposes, an onboarding sequence. And while we've already had a prologue, which onboarded us to basic movement and interactions, this next chapter in contemporary events sees us engage in more advanced mechanics, such as the cooperative gameplay, basic combat, and stealth. And the short episode sees us hunt down a character called Robert, who has double-crossed us in unseen events that lead up to our introduction to Ellie. But I also think it helps elaborate on the unruly, petty and dog-eat-dog world that we've now been reduced to and we find ourselves in. So once again, a nice juxtaposition with the prologue that we've just come off the back of, and we can very quickly see that we've said goodbye to the relatable world. The upshot of the opening act is that we've apprehended and killed this character of Robert, But this brings us into contact with the Fireflies and the character of Ellie, who we've now been contracted to escort to the Capitol building, thus launching us into the central arc of the game, where we are venturing through hostile territory to get Ellie where she needs to be. And the first couple of hours of the game are really interesting insofar as they are a departure from a lot of post-apocalyptic fiction, because most of the hostility and the danger that we encounter early on is at the hands of other human beings rather than the infected. And right from the moment the soldier shoots Joel's daughter in the beginning of the game, we are presented with a world that has crumbled as much because of the human response to the pandemic itself, as much as the zombies themselves. And I really like that, because unlike a lot of zombie fiction such as 28 Days Later or The Walking Dead, which sets up the story as man versus zombie, only to later sort of switch it to show the threat of the humans, The Last of Us establishes the humans as just as much of a threat, if not more so, than the infected in the wastelands beyond. And I like that because in several key scenarios, with the handful of people that we meet in this game, very few, in fact, which is Bill the survivalist, the brothers Sam and Henry, Tommy's group, and climactically David, who leads the group of cannibals, the story has cultivated by this point an air of distrust of basically any human that we might encounter, rightly or wrongly, and we come to appreciate the world, and particularly humanity, through Joel's eyes as a survivor who suffered the slings and arrows of the human condition. And so I suppose the title of the game, The Last of Us, is very fitting because it's about the state of humanity rather than the infected that have actually caused these issues. And actually, while playing The Last of Us, in the middle of the pandemic, as I mentioned, I was also reading World War Z, the original novel by Max Brooks, which I would highly recommend to anyone interested in this sort of genre. It's not a very long or complex book. And Brooks also uniquely focuses on the follies and the factionalizing of mankind in response to the zombie outbreak, rather than necessarily the zombies themselves too. And having experienced the real-world pandemic, which thankfully didn't involve zombies, while I was kind of consuming this media, it was quite interesting to see the parallels in how governments, societies and individuals react to these events and react to one another. Now, moving on to look at the central arc of Joel and Ellie coming to terms with the state of the world, but more so coming to terms with one another, I think this was a beautiful core arc that progressed evenly over the course of the game. And one thing I've noted earlier is that beyond the excellent chunking of the game, where we have the cinematic exposition followed by a puzzle or dungeon, followed by a new character or event, we actually get characterization and character development in-game, and owing to the consistent presence of the NPC Ellie and the cooperative nature of the gameplay, there's a lot of dialogue and even seemingly idle throwaway lines that build this relationship and build our ideas of these two characters. And thinking on it, there's not many games I've played that feature this sort of in-game deuteragonist partnership and dialogue. And historically, action-adventure games are played out as a solo character, whether that's Lara Croft, Nathan Drake, or whoever. So I did like it, and I suppose a benefit of technology now is that we can host these numerous animations and mechanical interactions in the game world. So yeah, great little slices of dialogue and development between Joel and Ellie that helps build our idea of their relationship and the progression and change of their relationship over the course of the game. And I suppose, turning to that now, right from the get-go there is friction between Ellie and Joel. And actually I suppose Ellie and most people, because she has this fiery, abrasive attitude, which, for example, quite amusingly, sees her threaten or outrightly attack several people upon meeting them, such as Joel and Tess, and later Bill with a length of pipe. And understandably for Joel, who is somewhat world-weary, her attitude and her over-enthusiasm at times, even towards some quite gruesome things, but also quite beautiful things too, such as the giraffe segment later in the game. This evidently grinds on him, and it's only Tess's conviction that Ellie's immunity to infection might provide a cure, and Joel's commitment to delivering her to the Fireflies, particularly once Tess is gone. It's only really his promise to Tess that keeps them together early in the game. And I've mentioned in the past this idea of the odd couple dynamic in fiction, which is really good for developing character and developing story, because you have two unlikely clashing personalities thrown together for whatever reason, and the conflict that arises tells us a lot about each of them. And while it is often used for comedies, it also works really well for dramatic stories too, as we see in this story. And to be fair, Joel and Ellie's relationship is not without its comedy as well. Now, I may well do separate episodes really zeroing in and focusing on each specific character in the series, but I would like to focus on Tess for just a moment, because she is a great character and significant for a number of reasons. Firstly, as an onboarding element to the setting and the advanced gameplay. She's a trusted confidant to Joel, which is another aspect of the story that's open to interpretation, as there's a couple of hints throughout that they may well be lovers, but chiefly in the events of the main game, Tess is a catalyst to driving events forward and securing Joel's commitment to Ellie, because it's almost literally her dying wish. And while Joel has a certain cold detachment and reluctance to pursue jobs when they extend beyond their remit or the safety of a contract, it is in parting ways with Tess and her sacrifice for their escape that really starts building the story and the next chapter of the game. And we start to see the uneasy relationship build up between Ellie and Joel off the back of this. And for example, upon escaping the Capitol building, Joel immediately chastises Ellie for mentioning Tess, then tells her to do what he says when he says it, which is the first of several parent-child sounding exchanges between the two, and an example of this inadvertent slip into a pseudo father-daughter relationship that Joel is consistently trying to resist over the course of the game. And there's various touch points where this is explored, and they begin to warm up towards one another. The first proper one, I'd say, is the car journey once we've left Bill's, because they are breaking the ice, chatting about casual things such as comic books and music, their personal passions. And these traits, such as Joel's love of country music and Ellie's love of comic books, I also think are significant in that they are the humanising aspects of their characters, the one thing they have to live for and enjoy, rather than simply surviving. So quite important subtext there, as well as kind of complementing how they build their relationship with one another. Again, the music thing carries over into the Last of Us Part 2. But later we see these parenting or guardianship scenarios develop further, albeit in the extreme circumstances of a post-apocalyptic survivalist world. And what I mean by that is, rather than Joel educating Ellie in how to ride a bike or how to do her math homework or any of this father-daughter stuff in our known reality, and what he would have done with his real daughter Sarah, he's teaching Ellie how to spot a bandit pretending to be injured, how to shoot a rifle, and how to stay aware and stay alive. And I thought that was really cool. It says a lot about the world, but it also says a lot about their improving relations, which again plays out both in-game and through the cutscenes. Now, as I mentioned, the handful of characters we meet through our adventure each inform the story and inform our perception of the adventure, and where Bill is quite a utilitarian character, I think he speaks more to the state of the world and progressing our adventure by providing us a vehicle, rather than necessarily reflecting anything about Joel and Ellie. But coming on to the brothers, Sam and Henry, who we meet shortly afterwards, these guys were excellent in how they reflected Joel and Ellie's journey back onto them. We had a guardian figure and a child who needed protecting, and Henry's caution and prioritisation of Sam, to the extent that he briefly abandons Joel and Ellie in dangerous circumstances, is precisely the sort of thing that we might expect Joel to do if it became a choice between keeping Ellie safe and danger, and Henry says as much when Joel threatens to shoot him. So really interesting interactions with these guys, and although our journey with them is brief, we learn enough about them to emote and empathise with them, and we know enough for it to be quite a heart-wrenching ending when we realise that Sam is infected, and we witness Henry shoot his brother and then himself in despair, which is one of the bleaker moments of the game. And I suppose we could look at this multiple ways. Firstly, it shows that there is humanity left in the world. The fact that after so much hostility from the military and the bandits and so on, Joel and Ellie have encountered genuinely good-natured, though cautious survivors such as themselves. But also, the fact that Henry kills himself, I think again speaks to humanity, because it's not enough simply to survive at all costs, but also to have something to live for, which for Henry was protecting his little brother. So all around one of the more powerful scenarios in The Last of Us, particularly that we see from temporary characters, which, as I say, I think reflects a lot of Joel and Ellie, back onto themselves in an objective way. So there's a couple more key touch points in the story that build on Joel and Ellie, hinging around our reintroduction to Joel's brother Tommy. And this is significant because we last saw him in the prologue as Sarah died in Joel's arms. Yet now, 20 years later, we can see the nature of the relationship has grown quite cold, and Tommy hints at Joel's quite questionable past in the actions that he took to keep himself and his brother alive. And again, this is another interesting glimpse at Joel's character that paint a picture of him as quite a grey, potentially almost villainous character from what's being said and reading between the lines there. And while we generally see him as a protagonist because of how he grows to become protective of Ellie, there are things that Tess says and things that Tommy says that throw shade on our image of him as a hero. And actually they leave us wondering whether Joel is any better than some of these bandits that we've encountered in things that he's supposed to have done. So I really like that. I think it gives a certain depth and third dimension to Joel that I think the climactic end events also attest to, which I'll come to shortly. And more so than that, the events of The Last of Us Part 2 attest to, quite controversially. But moving on, the second important scene at this juncture of the game is where Ellie briefly runs away and Joel confronts her in an abandoned house. And Ellie's chastising him and really begging him not to abandon her like everyone else has. And it's here that finally the elephant in the room of Joel's dead daughter is raised, and Joel quite brutally dismisses any notion that Ellie is like a daughter to him, or that he's a father to her. It's also an intriguing moment because we see a brief glimpse of the generational divide of Ellie and Joel, and particularly Ellie only knowing this post-apocalyptic world because she's reading a diary of a teenage girl who's evidently talking about movies or boys or whatever it is, and she says, is this all anyone had to worry about? And it's true, and I think Ellie's wonderment at the old world and the natural world comes through in several places, such as seeing monkeys in the university grounds and later the giraffes, and I think is really brought to a thematic head in the DLC Left Behind, which may be a discussion for another day. So this argument between Joel and Ellie is quite important, and Joel eventually, after a short combat scenario, does have a change of heart. He realises that Ellie is in fact probably safer with him. And rather than handing her over to Tommy, he doesn't actually say anything. He just confirms that he will take Ellie the rest of the way on her adventure. So, really heartwarming moment, and although no words are spoken about Joel's change of heart, it's a crucial emotional turning point in the game and their relationship, because now it's no longer a smuggling contract, it's no longer a job, it's a personal choice on Joel's part to continue looking after Ellie. And I think that's what makes it so important and so powerful. And so this scene is not only pivotal, but it also sets us up for the final act of the game, which is hugely important for story and for the character of Joel. And it sets us up for Ellie's characterisation in The Last of Us Part 2 as well, I think. Now, once again, remarking on the pace of the game, there's a lull in the action here, and there's quite a wholesome respite from the bandit-ridden intensity of the world that we've ventured through so far, as we simply see Joel and Ellie riding on horseback through quiet university grounds, doing some puzzles, killing some infected where we come across them. But for all intents and purposes, it's a calm, emotional reprieve from everything we've just been through, and we understand that Joel and Ellie are now firmly committed to one another. But this is short-lived, and shortly after this we see a cutscene where Joel gets critically injured, where he falls from a balcony and gets skewered on some rusty metal, which is a huge curveball because it actually begins to feel at this point like the game is drawing to a close. It feels like we're near the end and we've reached this moment of calm, only to be thrown into this dramatic new direction, which precedes the final stanza of the game. And this unexpected curveball is what takes The Last of Us into its most intense and transitional crescendo, where in many respects we see the protagonistic torch passed from Joel to Ellie, or if not quite that, then at least the life lessons and the survivalism passed from Joel to Ellie. And this renewed independence, maturity, and ability to survive in Ellie is established through her contact with the villainous character of David. And this guy is a fantastic antagonist we encounter while we are hunting in the depths of winter, and where Ellie was a character who earlier in the game asked Joel if they should stop and help this seemingly injured man, only for Joel to instinctively know that this guy is a bandit attempting to trap them, and he runs him over without a second thought. Ellie has by now inherited this caution and this survival instinct from Joel, and refuses to lower her guard in front of David and his comrade, even with David's seemingly soothing, amicable nature, and even after they've both survived a horde of infected. So this is a great part of the story, unexpected part of the story, that elevates Ellie to the forefront of the action as a playable character, but also shows a much darker, brutal side to both Joel and Ellie, since David mentions to us that some of his survivors were recently murdered by a guy travelling with a little girl, which makes us look at Joel and Ellie again from a different perspective and a slightly removed objective angle. But we also see Joel, who is now recovering, try and catch up to Ellie because she's been taken, and he brutally tortures some of David's group to find out where she is. And climactically, we have a really intense boss fight between Ellie and David, where she ends up butchering him with a machete. So again, really interesting scenario that shows the brutality that both Ellie and Joel are capable of, and it's only really assuaged by our knowledge that David's group are themselves brutal and cannibalistic, which makes our murdering of them slightly more acceptable in the eyes of the player. Moving on to the final scenario of the story, and the big twist that leaves The Last of Us on something of a cliffhanger, we arrive at the Fireflies' laboratory, finally fulfilling our mission of delivering Ellie so that they might develop a cure, only for Joel to learn that Ellie is going to die during this operation because the virus, the cordyceps, grow all over the brain. And our final escape/combat scenario sees us lay waste to the Fireflies and their stronghold, rescuing an unconscious Ellie in the process. And the game closes on Joel promising Ellie that the Fireflies had simply stopped looking for a cure, and that there were dozens of kids like Ellie with an immunity, but nothing worked. So it is Joel's big lie that I would argue didn't necessarily set The Last of Us up for a sequel, or warrant a sequel, but it definitely crystallised much of the dubious greyness and the moral complexities that dictates so much of the game's characters and the world that they are living in. And while I think many, and indeed most fans, were probably glad that Joel saved Ellie and empathised with his decision because, much like he taught her how to survive, she had given him something to live for as well. I think on a macro scale, the fact that he has quite possibly prevented mankind from ridding itself of the infected and the fear of being infected, with Ellie's sacrifice providing a cure, we can see it on a grander scale as quite a selfish and narrow decision. So I really liked that ending. I like that it ended on that final deception without any real closure, and it employed the classic trolley problem to conclude game events, which I've discussed before in my Life is Strange retrospective, which used a very similar philosophical model to end on. But unlike Life is Strange, the player has no choice or agency in Joel's decision, and in this sense, The Last of Us relies on what is a very classic cinematic narrative that removes the player from decision making. So obviously we can operate within and observe what our characters are doing, but not directly intervene or dictate with decision trees or forks in the road. And I like that too, because I think decision trees in games are growing in popularity, and they certainly have their place, and elevate stories with player agency in many ways. But equally, I think telling that concise, objective story is still a very powerful thing. So, drawing this retrospective to a close, there's a few bits I've skirted around, or briefly summarised, such as gameplay mechanics. But I'd also just like to shout out on the music score and the sound design of this game. And I think music scores in games are sometimes left by the wayside, particularly titles where there's so much story and character to focus on. But the use of sound, and indeed, in particular, the use of silence to elevate the eeriness and foreboding dread within these often dank environments in The Last of Us, they really add to the emotion and the intensity and the feeling of this game experience. And I really think the use of sound augments the scenarios and the situations in the game. Both those of suspense during, the dungeon crawls, but also those of optimism and calm and peace and that sort of thing too. With the short reprieve in the university grounds, as I mentioned, with simple birdsong accompanying us being a great example of that. So there we have it, a look at The Last of Us Part 1, which took a while for me to get around to playing, but an experience that I think really does live up to the hype that the game has enjoyed since its release. I think it has plenty of replay value and is a bleak yet expertly unfolding story that'll stay with me and I'm sure I will return to.